In the beginning, I didn't know much about manual camera settings. I usually just put the camera in auto and I let the camera do all the thinking for me. But I didn't want to let the camera do all the thinking for me. I wanted to be able to set the settings manually. So I learned the 3 most basic things in order for me to set the settings manually on my camera. And in this video, I'm going to try and explain these 3 things in the most simplest form. So the most basic things you need to know about is 1. ISO, 2. Aperture, and 3. Shutter speed. And in the end of the video, I'm also going to talk about the 180-degree rule for video, because the shutter speed is impacted by this rule. Thank you for clicking into this video. If you're new here, please consider hitting the subscribe button down below. And if you watched this video all the way to the end, and I highly recommend that you do, and you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it, and it would really help me with the YouTube algorithm. In order for you to see with your own eyes, you need light. If you're in a totally dark room, you don't see anything. But if you're outside in bright sunlight, there's almost too much light. So you need to find a balance between dark and light in order for you to see perfectly. And the same comes for a camera. In order for the camera to see what's in front of it, it needs the perfect amount of light. All these 3 things controls how much light that gets into your sensor. So let's start at the beginning. What is ISO? ISO is how sensitive your camera's sensor is to light. And ISO is the first thing you need to set on your camera in any given scenario. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the camera's sensor is to light. And the lower the ISO, the less sensitive your camera sensor is to light. So the natural thing would be to think that, okay, I'm just going to crank my ISO all the way up so that all the light is going to hit my sensor. But it's actually the opposite. You want to set the ISO as low as you can. Yes, your sensor is more sensitive to light with a higher ISO, but with the higher sensitivity on your sensor, there will also be more grain and more noise to your picture. Just think of yourself standing outside in bright sunlight and there's just too much light. That's why you need sunglasses, because with too much light you can't see anything. It's too bright. So for a general rule about the ISO, you can say that if you're outside, you want to put your ISO as low as it gets, around 100 or maybe 200. If it's cloudy outside, you want to bump it up to 400 maybe. And if you're inside, you might want to put it at 400, 800, even 3200. It all depends on your camera, because with a more expensive camera, your sensor is probably more capable of dealing with a higher ISO. So remember to put the ISO as low as you can. The second thing I want to talk about is aperture. Aperture is the size of the opening in your lens. And the bigger the opening in your lens, the more light comes into your sensor. And the smaller the opening, the less light comes into your sensor. Aperture is measured in f-stops. Like this 22mm Canon lens, this has an f-stop at 2.0. And this 50mm lens has an f-stop of 1.8. It's usually printed onto your lens what f-stop or stops the lens has. The lower the number, or the lower the f-stop, the bigger the opening in your lens is. And the higher the number, the smaller the opening in your lens is. This doesn't actually make any sense. A low ISO number gives a bigger opening, and a high ISO gives a smaller opening. An f-stop of 1.8 is actually 1 over 1.8, and an f-stop of, let's say, 6 is actually 1/6. So when you see it like this, an f-stop of 1.8 is actually a higher number than an f-stop of 6. As I said, an f-stop of 1.8 gives you a big opening and lets in a lot of light to your sensor, and an f-stop at, let's say, 6 gives you a smaller opening and you get less light into your camera. But Aperture also controls depth of field. Now, depth of field is how much is in focus in front of or behind of the spot that you're focusing on. The lower the f-stop, the less is in focus in front of or behind, and the higher the f-stop, more is in focus. For example, with a lower f-stop, you get a more blurry background, and with a higher f-stop, you get a less blurry background because more is in focus. Now, the blurry background is also known as bokeh, so you can say that with a lower f-stop, you get more bokeh. With a higher f-stop, you get less bokeh. The third thing I want to talk about is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is the amount of time measured in seconds that your shutter is open. In front of your camera's sensor, there's a shutter. This shutter, when it opens, lets light into your sensor. And depending on how long the shutter is open, the more light gets into your sensor. Shutter speed is normally shown in numbers like 1/50th of a second, 100th of a second, 1/250th of a second, and it goes on and on. You can also slow down your shutter speed to 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, even 30 seconds. The longer your shutter is open, the more light comes into your sensor. But the more light that comes into your sensor, the more motion blur you will get in your photo. For photography, if you have something moving around and you want to capture that perfect, crispy picture of something moving, then you want a quick shutter speed like 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second. It all depends on how much your subject is moving. But if you want more motion blur to your picture or more light into the sensor, the slower your shutter speed should be. In order for night photographers to capture all the stars in the night sky, they might even use a shutter speed up to 30 seconds. But if you do use a long shutter opening, you need to make sure that your camera is standing completely still. Because if there's any movement in your camera while the shutter is open, you will get a lot of motion blur on everything that the camera is capturing. And here comes the difference between photography and if you want to do video. When making video, you want the video to be as normal or realistic as possible. You want your video to have the same motion blur that you see with your own eyes. And here comes the 180-degree rule you need to know about when you're doing video. And this impacts your shutter speed. And the 180-degree rule says that your shutter speed should be the double of your frame rate. And what is a frame rate? A video or live image is nothing else than a lot of still images or frames shown at a set speed. A normal or natural speed in order for your eyes to see live footage is 24 frames every second. That means you need to have 24 still images put together in 1 second in order for your eyes to see this as a natural movement. And with the 180-degree rule, if you're shooting video with 24 frames per second, you should double your shutter speed of 24 or 25, depending on where you are. And this means that your shutter speed should be 1/50th of a second. If you want to slow down your video or use slow motion, you need to put in extra frames in that second in order for you to drag it out so you see slow motion. So that means if you're shooting in 50 or 60 frames per second, the 180-degree rule says that your shutter speed should be 100th or 120th of a second. So that means that if you're going to adjust something to get more light into your camera, you cannot change your shutter speed because your shutter speed is locked down according to what frame rate you're shooting in. So if you need to adjust your camera settings while shooting video in order to get more light into your camera or into your sensor, you cannot change your shutter speed. You need to change your ISO or your aperture. To sum it up, it all comes down to how much light you have. And all the three things I've talked about today, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, they all work together at adjusting how much light that comes into your camera. So first, you want to set your ISO depending on where you are. If you're outside, you can put your ISO at 100 or 200. If you're inside, 400, 800, even 3200, depending on what kind of camera you have. Second, you want to set your aperture or depth of field. How much blurriness do you want in the background of your picture? And third, choose your shutter speed. How much motion blur do you want in your picture? And if you're doing video, remember the 180-degree rule that says you have to double your shutter speed according to what frame rate you're shooting in. And as I said, all of these three things are working together, adjusting how much light it gets into your camera, and changing one of them will have an effect on the other two. So I hope this video was helpful in some kind of way. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. If you're new here, please consider hitting the subscribe button. If you've been here before, thank you so much for coming back. And when it's all said and done, I hope I see you in another video. Thank you. Bye.